My name is Jennifer McLeod. I'm chaplain for the London College, and I'm here to introduce Reverend David Jackson, our next speaker. He's been at Scots College, this is his 12th year. He was appointed initially in 2009 as assistant chaplain and RE teacher, and in 2017 was appointed chaplain. Grew up in the South Island, born in Dunedin, a place close to my heart, and went to Wellington for university. He's been there since, with now his wife Linda and 3 children. And he said to me he was very grateful to the board of Scots College for allowing him to have scholarship last year, time to study Māori expressions of Christianity, which I believe is what you're going to come and speak to us now. David, come on up.
I te tuatahi whakakarorea ki te atua te ariki te rangi me tēnei whenua hoki. Kia te taha o toko whaia, me mihi ana au ki ngā tohu o ni o Mirihiku, te whenua o ka tamarikitanga. Ko taki tīmu, te maunga, runei taku ngākau, ko oriti te awa e amahia nei aku māharahara. Kia te taha o toko mātua, ko tauwhare te maunga, kaipara te awa, ko ngā te whātua te iwi te tau te hapu, ko rewati te whenua, whiti te rā, te marae. Ko te whanganui a tara, toko kāinga i whānau mai aku tamariki ki kora. Ko David toko ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm from. If you can't quite make out the pictures, down the bottom of the South Island is where I grew up, near Takatimu Mountains, and believe it or not, that tin shed up in the top left there, that's my family marae up near Auckland, and I visited that for the first time this year. But that's a bit about me. Let me tell you about this character, Hemi Portakai. Ngāti whātua, sorry, beg your pardon, that's me, not him. Ngāti kahungunu te iwi, rākai pākata hapu, tāne nui arangi te marae. Portakai was born in 1905 and he lived a life of firsts. He was the first student of Māori descent to attend Scots College. He started there in 1920, 5 years after the college was established, and he attended with the help of this woman, Sister Edith Walker. She helped pay his fees to go here. While he was a student, he played in the first 15 and seemed like he did a lot of things as well as study, but he gifted the first 15 and eventually the college haka. And we've just had that kind of repolished and revamped this year in honour of his time. He went on from Scots College to attend Knox Theological College. He was the first Māori to graduate from that college and be ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and he eventually became a moderator of what is now Te Akapuaho, and the man who's just appeared down there next to him, and the next to Sister Edith Walker, is Hone Lawton, one of a Scotsman, one of his mentors, and I'll hopefully remember to mention him later. As well as being a church leader, he was instrumental in the establishment of Māori language departments in broadcasting. He was a big driver behind Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori. And so, inspired by this amazing servant of God, I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship from the school last year to explore how does his life and his faith, what can that teach us? How can I, as a chaplain, look at his life and think about the bicultural New Zealand that my students are graduating into? And it turns out that there's no real simple answer to this question, so I've just written down some stories that I wanted to share with you. And I'll give you a couple of maps. If I've zoomed in too far, the map on the left is Northland. Off the bottom of the map is Auckland City. Just above that you'll see Rewati Marae, which I mentioned before, in Makarang Harbour. All the way up the top there, the little black mark is Marsden Cross, And then the map on the right is the second one. That's Bay of Plenty at the top and East Cape on the right-hand side. And so I travelled down from Ohopi down through to Urewera and out to Nuhaka. But first, the first thing I want to tell you this is that I think Marsden Cross, Oihi and the Waitangi Treaty Grounds are places that every New Zealander should visit. But a highlight for me personally was that I got to take my dad away with me on this trip because I had never visited, I'd never been north of Browns Bay in Auckland, and so I'd never visited our marae. But I'd used these words, Rewati and Mahurangi and Pepeha, when I'd spoken in places, and they became real life places to me. And I saw my family name in Urupa on headstones and things like that. And this history that I'd kind of grown up with as a kid my whole life became something really real for me when I started seeing these things in real life. Now, before I tell you my story, I want to just look at this word biculturalism. I think it's a word that trips us up sometimes. We can think of New Zealand as multicultural, and that's true. We have, Kai Tahu and Te Aotearoa, Chinese, English, Samoan, all these different cultures in our country. But all of us will fit into these two groups, either tangata whenua, that's people of the land, or tangata treaty, people of the treaty. And of course, that overlaps as well. There are people who will fit into both. What I mean by tangata whenua, the best way I've explained that in English is you get your New Zealanderness from time immemorial. You've always been here. And you can stand literally on the land for your identity. Tangata treaty, you have a legal document that you can stand on and say, I am a New Zealander because of this document. And both of those are valid and important ways to be New Zealanders. And so I've stopped using words like Pākehā or other words and started using words like tangata treaty as a way of saying my New Zealanderness as a Pākehā or whatever is really valid. It's just as valid as tangata whenua. I'm just as much a New Zealander because of that. Okay, story number one. You've probably heard of what happened on Christmas Day in 1814. And the Reverend Samuel Marsden preached at Rangihawa Bay. This is it here, looking down on it. You can see this wee kind of hilly knob there with the cuts on it. That was the Pā site. And down at the bottom there's the bay where he preached. And I've highlighted the little white box is where Marsden Cross is. And that's how big Marsden Cross is compared to my dad. So we presumably know this story because we've sung the song Te Haranui, which tells about the first time the gospel was preached in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a really familiar song. I didn't know this, it was written in the 50s, so it's been around for a while, but it misses quite a few details. For example, what led up to this point? What was it that brought Marsden over anyway? Did he just rock up and preach? And then what happened afterwards? Did he hang around? Was he run out of town? What happened? The quiet bay of which the song speaks, known as Oihi or Hohi or Rangihawa, had a pā in it, and the local rangatira there, his name was Ruatara. He had travelled to Sydney, and that is where he met Marsden and befriended him. And it's because of this relationship that Marsden was invited to come to New Zealand and to preach. Rangihawa Bay is now a historical park, and as you enter, you go between these two po. And on the left it has the name Marsden carved, and on the right it has the name Ruatara. There's two people responsible for the Gospel's introduction to New Zealand. In fact, Ruatara is known as Ruatara Te Ara o Te Rongopai. That means Ruatara, the pathway for the Gospel. Now on that day we know that Marsden preached on Luke chapter 2. It was Christmas Day after all. I bring you tidings of great joy. And he set up a mission there. But he didn't stick around. And then the accounts of the foreign missionaries who were there, they're pretty unimpressive. But somehow, the good news of great joy managed to travel right across this country. And it wasn't by foreign missionaries, it was by Māori evangelists, and it was shared in Te Reo Māori. Two Bible stories I think about when I think of this story, the first of which is the Tower of Babel. And I was raised kind of with the understanding that the Tower of Babel is a story of God getting grumpy at people for breaking the rules, and it's a bit of a punishment. But in recent times I've been thinking of it more as a story of creation. Right from Genesis 1, in Genesis 1, God is separating things and putting diversity into the world. Genesis chapter 2, he creates a man and woman, a gender diversity, and in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, they think, let's reach God in our monolingual, monocultural monolith, and God said, that's not how the world's meant to be. And so it creates this diverse linguistic and cultural world. So I'm actually, and I'll tell you about also, of course, the story of Pentecost, another Bible story that deals particularly with language. The events of Acts chapter 2, often thought of as the birthday of the church, the very first event in church history, you could say, was for God's Spirit to be poured out on people so that those from all over the world could understand what the disciples are saying. And I think that's important for us to remember, because God could just have easily made it so that the people visiting could understand the local language. I mean, if God's going to change people's understanding of languages, he could have just made everyone monocultural. But instead, God's Spirit's poured out to make things much more diverse. The church has been diverse from its beginning. Now, let's get back to these shores here. This is Reverend Kingi Ihaka, and he likens the Gospel's translation not to language or to the events of Acts chapter 2, but instead he likens it to a poi which flies around the country. And he's written a song called He Poi, and it names the places that the gospel travelled to and the people who took it there. And hopefully, I didn't check this before we started, I've got a 45-second clip I can play. Will it start playing some songs? The volume's up? Let's give it a try. It's embedded in the PowerPoint. I'd like to learn how to sing this song, but I'm not going to learn it here. Let me try. No, it's not even my slides.
Can you go back?
Oh, here we go. Shall we go into it?
Oh. Titiro e mai wite ka puta puringa he tauma te nei na ngā tupuna he poi hei. Koi puritia, koi takawiri tau patu matu ko te tau. Patu taku poi, kare ne taku poi, ere tika atu ana kātau ki ngāpu. Keira te toka, keira ni hoa, kei hoi ira, ko te toka pēna, i hoa e te rongo paira e.
Did we hear the words rangi haua come through? Oihi? This type of thing. That's only the first part of the song. It goes on to mention all the way down to Wanganui and across to the east coast of the North Island. But he doesn't mention the South Island, so I thought maybe I'd share with you how the gospel came to the South Island. It's an important story for me because I live in Porirua, where this guy, Te Rauparaha, who knows Te Rauparaha? Fantastic. He, Ngāti Toa is the mana whenua where I live. Te Rauparaha is the famous rangatira there. He's famous for that, and he's famous for writing the haka kamati, which the All Blacks perform. Except they no longer perform it in the South Island, because the other thing he's famous for is coming down to Kaiapoi and beating the snot out of people. And so, I think it's a good thing they don't perform his haka down here. But there's another Te Rauparaha, Tamihana Te Rauparaha, that's his son. And he actually was with his father when he invaded. And Tamihana came down later on as an adult. He converted to Christianity, and if you know the story of Te Rori in her book, he was converted as part of kind of that story. He came down to here, and he was asked by the locals, it's a bit worrying you being here, what's going to happen? And this is a quote that he said, translated of course. He said, I've indeed come hither to you to bring an end to warfare and to bind firmly peace by virtue of the words of the gospel of the Lord. This, I think, as we think about how we need to include New Zealand history in our curriculums going forward, we're in a really interesting place. There are stories of redemption and reconciliation, of biculturalism that are really important to our history, and I think as church schools we've got a really amazing opportunity to share these local histories with people. A couple of other important stories for me, because I think that these stories of redemption and of the gospel are our stories too, as church schools. And what I mean by church, by our stories, is best summed up in a story from Year 7 EOTC. As part of our EOTC program, I took our Year 7s to this marae. This is Te Kākano Te Aroha Marae in Lower Hutt. It's our local Presbyterian church marae. Sadly, it's the world's most southern Presbyterian marae. But it was amazing to go there. And after we'd had our pōwhiri and were welcomed in, and they explained a bit of the carvings around the place, and they pointed out Roa Kenana, who was on one of the carvings, and they also pointed out Hone Lawton, John Lawton, who I mentioned at the beginning. I just politely interrupted our host and said, look, can I just add something to that about the carving of Hone Lawton? Because one of his students, Hemi Portato, was a student of ours at Scots. And in fact, one of our junior school houses is named Portato House after him. And so with these Year 7s, I stopped them and said, look, who was in Portato House last year? And a number of them put their hands up. And I made the connection, Portato, Lawton, this type of thing. And straight away, their eyes picked up. And they knew that this story, this carving on this wall, was their story as well. They'd drawn that line. It was like, for me, although I don't have carvings in a wharenui to look at, I have names on headstones and things that connect me to Urupa and Marae. It was that moment for them. It made the stories come so much more alive. And when the line had been drawn from them to Portato to Lawton, and then of course right at the figurehead there to Christ and to God, the story all kind of connected together for them. So my journey, originally I had intended to understand my Māori whakapapa better, and how perhaps utilising that could help me with students in a bicultural situation. But actually it led me to understand myself and value my Pākehā identity much stronger. And I think that's for us as schools who want to connect, there's a parallel there. We want to connect with mana whenua, with our Māori in really genuine ways. But there's no point in pretending that we come to these relationships with a blank slate. We have a history and a story, and we want to connect and weave together together, as Kim was saying, with other people with histories and stories. But what we might also discover, as I've discovered, that there's been a lot of weaving happening before we even decided to start joining in the conversation. Here's just another little thought, perhaps, for us in our schools. As students will see pictures like this, and they will point out that that's not what Jesus actually looked like. And I've used those comments as a really good teaching opportunity to say, hey, but, you know, it's a very good cultural interpretation, probably for a culture on the other side of the world, to understand that Jesus is one with us. But do our students associate this depiction of Jesus as equally culturally influenced and equally valuable and important in our world, in our country? Or when we say church, do they think of churches like that, when we could equally mean churches like this one? This, some of you will recognise, is the Church Marae at Hopi, which I think for us is probably as relevant a symbol of our church as the one below could be. In fact, I'm not even sure it's a Presbyterian church, but okay, last story from me, and it's about the church at Hopi and a short visit I had there. You'll know that at the top, the figure of the church is Jesus Christ, but along the sides, on the insides of the church, are carvings, and each of them is from a different part of the country, and they all tell a different biblical story, or rather they all tell a story which tells the same story as a biblical story. So, for example, the one that stood out to me was Paikia and Piripua, who rescued people from a flood by climbing a mountain. And there's parallels there, of course, with Noah and the ark. But the one that really captured my attention was right down the very back. It's kind of the last one in the building. And that bird to the side of the figure is actually above the figure in the real carving. And I looked at it and I kind of went, oh yeah, bird like a dove, but the Holy Spirit is above someone's head. Oh, sometimes when there's the Spirit as a flame above people's heads, and this is kind of at the end of the whare. Maybe this is the story of Pentecost, of the Spirit coming and sending the disciples out, or guiding them and empowering them as they go. And I asked, am I correct in guessing that, because I wanted some kind of like brownie points, but they said to me, oh, that's really interesting, because the bird there is a mātangi, and they're the birds that helped the waka navigate their way to Aotearoa. So I'm still not sure whether this is meant to depict Pentecost or not, but a story really close to my heart that I know as an RE teacher, as a chaplain, as a Christian, I could see and look at that, and stories, of course, that they knew they brought to the table and pulled together. So, I feel I've just left a mess of stories and ideas and things that I find interesting just on your laps, and I'm happy to leave it that way, because I think what I've done is proven that I'm not an expert in this. I'm just an excited student who wants to share some things that I've learned. And hopefully, as we all hope, you can become excited students too in this type of area. So those of you who are excited, these are two books that I think every one of our schools should have. Awesome. That was a funny voice.
That was funny.
Do people want to ask questions, or can I sit down and stop being nervous? Yeah, Jill.
Do you still sing Te Haranui? Sing Te Haranui?
I mean, I only think about that at Christmas time. I was preparing different words, because I think it's still a really important story, but just like reading the first page and not actually knowing what's going on.
I
over here in this chapel when we were doing a Christmas Eve service, or we taking the service, and an old Legion came back to school, and he must have left school maybe 11 years ago, and he got in touch with Paul afterwards and was quite aggressive in his criticism of us singing that song, and it was really interesting how in his life beyond St Andrews and where we were at the time that he was here, he didn't appreciate how far we've come, but we also had really articulated in our own minds perhaps the inappropriateness of that hymn, which was always a beautiful way of singing, isn't it? So we did make peace with him, or Paul did, after that, and explained how far we had come in time. But it's interesting to hear it brought up again.
And it's kind of like Kim was saying, like colonisation did happen and it sucks. But, you know, from my memory, I wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for that. But we also wouldn't be bicultural if it wasn't for that as well. So the world is what it is, right? And we just kind of have to make the best of that and kind of heal it. The other thing that kind of just came to mind as you guys were talking was that, and no disrespect to you, Jordan, I think it's wonderful to travel to the other side of the world and find connections that way. But I think too, we've got so many stories of the gospel and of Christ working in this country that we should point to. One thing that I shared with Stephanie was it drives me crazy that every year at Easter time we always have to say, oh, Easter's now because on the other side of the world it's springtime and that's when life is, all this type of stuff. But then you look out the window and the trees are dead and dying and it's absolutely Good Friday out there. And then you turn around and look at your feijoa tree and it's so full and abundant and there's too many feijoas for one person to eat, right? So why are we not using feijoa as our Easter symbol and that abundance, even when things are dying? So this year, in fact, our receptionist said, do you have a little cross? And she put a little cross on the receptionist people come into the school. And I thought, oh, well, I might give you some other symbols at different times of the year. And at Easter time, I gave her some feijoas to put at the foot of our little cross. And she then ended up writing a little note to explain to people why I was sitting there. So, you know, I think that's it too. We can be, I think our people who've gone before us were really into this whole Scottish thing and what God did over there. We should probably get just as excited about what God's been doing here. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
David, on behalf of us all, I just want to say thank you so much for that excellent talk. You've shared with us in such a personal way, such an engaging way, and you really enthused us and made us really want to go back to our schools to use lots of all your ideas and imagination and thoughts, and certainly the feijoa. There'll certainly be feijoas instead of eggs.